I'm going to start today with a very strange announcement that came up this morning, which is if you have looked at the schedule for next quarter and are planning when you're taking things next quarter, Game Dev 2, as of this morning, has changed when it is being offered and how it is being offered. And this was done to remove as many conflicts as possible between when classes are being offered. And I seem to be the only person in the department who is remotely flexible with these things. So instead of being a 2-day-a-week lab in the afternoon, it is now a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday class at noon with a Friday lab. And the Friday lab is because no other CS lab is happening on Friday afternoons. So that should remove some conflicts with some other classes. That said, if that's a big conflict to people in this class, for some reason, I want to know now so that I can take that into consideration and see if there's some additional change that I can make that makes that better for your schedule.
Is the schedule released for next quarter for other classes?
I think you can search view only. But yeah, we're making
classes. You go to browse classes, not register, but browse, you can see them.
Cool. Yeah. So if you were planning on this being a 2-day-a-week, I think it was originally a Monday, Wednesday afternoon lab, something like that.
And those are pretty set in stone, right?
The
if you do the browse classes.
Yeah, they're usually fairly set in stone, but Stu discovered yesterday that there were large amounts of overlaps in Wednesday labs and Thursday labs. There were like 6 labs happening in those afternoons. And so we were trying to pull out as many as we could. And my class seemed like something that was pretty flexible. And I also somewhat want to redesign how the lecture portion of that class went last time, rather than having a 2.5-hour lecture. No one really likes that when it's a dense topic like reinforcement learning. So I'm going to give it a try as a 3-day-a-week lecture. And then the lab portion of Game Dev 2 will be you're working on your games in groups on Friday afternoons.
It's not updated in the.
It's not updated yet.
Yeah. So, but when is the time of the class in terms of the time slot?
Yeah, it'd be noon on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. So that overlaps only the prerequisite to the course, which is 350
for an hour.
So from 12 to 12:50.
12 to 12:50, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then Friday from 1 to 3.
Okay.
That's the current draft, but I have time to change that only if people let me know in the next couple of days. I just wanted to announce that and ask if anyone had any conflicts or if that was going to create a big problem with someone's schedule for something that we're not taking into consideration, that we could take into consideration potentially. So take a look at your schedule, take a look at what you're planning to take. Hopefully this makes your next quarter easier rather than more difficult, but if it makes it more difficult, let me know and I'll try to incorporate it in some way, shape, or form. We're still going through the layered tetrad. We have a bit of that to go still, so we're gonna dive in and get through this as reasonably quickly as possible because there are very cool, fun things on the other side of this, and I know this is more lecturing than I typically like to do in a game design class, and it's all kind of in a row. So we're just gonna dive back into it, get through it as quickly as we can do it justice. Any questions or concerns before we go do that? All right, so we're still in the inscribed layer. The game as it exists outside of gameplay in theory. We had talked about everything through, we're now in the aesthetics. So we're looking at how the game appeals to the 5 senses, but from its design. So if you're designing for vision, this is something that you have a lot of control over as a developer. A lot of effort ends up going into the visual aesthetic of a game. You can distinguish a game from other games sometimes depending a lot on that visual aesthetic. If I say something like Borderlands, you get the sense of the visual aesthetic of that game that no other game really does quite the same. Any other examples of games that you are aware of or that you've played that have a very distinct visual style?
All of the personas.
Personas, yeah.
First time Minecraft was definitely really unique.
Yep. Voxel type games that have now been copied a bunch of times, but Minecraft really did the first big step into the voxel design. Any others?
No.
Sorry? Neighbor. Roller Coaster Tycoon, more for its technology, I think, than anything, considering it was coded in assembly.
Mario's very interesting.
Yeah, Mario. Yeah, just think of looking at a screenshot of a game and immediately knowing what game it came from without any characters, without any just the visual style of the game. You would immediately know what that is. Yeah.
Do you like for the aesthetic? Are you just including the vision, or are you going to go into like audio as well?
Oh yeah, everything. But for now, just the visual style.
Metroid, Castlevania.
Yeah,
My age here.
yeah. Especially back in the N64 PS1 era.
Ooh, the old Resident Evil. Like the very first Resident Evil on PlayStation 1.
Yeah.
Speaking of blocks.
Yeah. So you know that graphics have improved tremendously over time, but you don't have to rely on incredible textures in order to make your game distinct or different. There are different visual styles that can be very appealing. And this isn't just the character models and texturing, but the vision also includes things like your box art, which isn't as much of a thing anymore, but the website design, the design of if this is a game on Steam, for instance, it can just be the background of the game on Steam. It can look appealing as you are visiting the store's page, what you choose to be in the trailer for the game on a site. And yeah, any advertising, any trailers, font choices, how easy to read is it, or how distinct is the font choice within the game? Anything that's on the website. Yeah, Undertale is also a very distinct visual style. One thing to note, though, is that you don't want to make different decisions between these different ideas. You want there to be a cohesive theme to all of your visual aesthetic. You should be able to tell from the font what the visual style is of the game. They should not conflict. Audio also has improved tremendously over the last 25 years. But also noting what platform you are developing for can change a lot of how you approach the audio in a game. So if you're designing a console or PC game, then audio is very high quality and you can put a lot of time and effort into the audio. On the other hand, if you're designing a mobile game, a lot of people play mobile games without any sound whatsoever. So maybe all of the time and effort that you pour into the audio of your game never gets heard. The game should stand alone with or without audio and not rely on the audio to set the tone, to set the stage for what is being delivered. So what is good surround sound versus a tiny phone speaker? There's no way to get high quality phone audio out of a phone's speakers. They just suck. And yeah, people who play mobile games often mute their devices while playing. And that changes a lot how you go about the aesthetic of your game. Different types of audio, very good for different types of things. So this is not just things like the soundtrack. This can be sound effects, anything that's useful for any immediate effect, alerting the player that something is happening that they need to be aware of and react to. Any kind of simple information that should be part of the sound effect design. Music is best for medium-term effects, setting the mood, setting the stage for what's happening in the game. So if something is happening over a little bit of a longer term, put that feeling or that idea into the music rather than into the sound effects. Dialogue, medium-term to long-term, conveying complex information that can't easily be conveyed via a music theme or via a sound effect. That goes into the dialogue. It's interesting to see how these things interrelate as well. Something that should be a sound effect, if that is being portrayed through dialogue, it almost breaks the fourth wall. Something like, you hear something around the corner. It's very distinct if in the audio and a surround sound, you hear a clink, clink, clink. That makes you think, what was that? If a character speaks to you and says, "What was that noise around the corner?" It kind of breaks the fourth wall. It's what if it's something that we're scared of, if this is something that is horror, why are you telling me that in a voice? Shut up. We don't know if it's dangerous. It doesn't make sense. So just figuring out where the different sounds go based on how you want to set that stage. Make sure that it's convincing. Touch is mostly used in for paper games. So things like the tactile sensation of the game pieces themselves. What does it feel like to roll a die? Depending on the outcome that you're trying to get. If you want there to be mystery to the outcome of something, it feels very different to tap your phone and get a random number out of a random number generator versus actually tactilely rolling a physical game piece. It may seem like it's a very small decision, but the fact that the outcome is unknown for longer while the game piece is spinning across the board adds tension. Not something that people really think too much about, but it can change how the game feels to play. Are you rolling a paper die or a die that's made of something? Imagine it rolling a paper die, and that feels really cheap. It takes away from the feeling of the randomizer versus rolling something that feels or looks high quality. Will those game pieces last over the life cycle of the game, or will they fall apart and break? 3D printing a lot of game pieces is fun and cool, but of course you want to make sure that it's high quality 3D printing. If you're trying to do something like 3D printing a die, you don't want to throw off the balance of the die due to shoddy 3D printing quality. For digital games, any tactile sensation of using a controller or the keyboard and mouse, so how the controls feel to use, that is a tactile sensation that belongs in the inscribed aesthetics as you're designing what the control scheme should be. Think about what the layout is like on different kinds of controllers, what the layout is like on a keyboard. Does it make sense given what the game is supposed to do? Do you frequently have to go from one side of the keyboard to the other side of the keyboard based on the default key layouts? Are you forcing your players to go through and change the controls in order for it to be comfortable for most of them? Put a lot of thought into those default layouts so you minimize the number of players who need to go make changes. As an example, adults hated the DS. Why? Tiny little screen made for children. Hard to do this over a long period of time on a very small display. It ends up causing physical pain. It was obviously designed for children. Any motion that is required to play games, be aware of any repetitive actions that are required in the game. Can't tell you how many clicker games I have uninstalled due to just the requirement of repeatedly tapping a screen and then noping out of it. Carpal tunnel, controller thumb, all of that is something that can be reduced or removed with good design. Any rumble feedback that you can add to a controller is designed and can lead to some kind of reaction. The idea would be that you don't overuse it. For narrative, this is now how the designers are adding story elements to the game. They've been designed and inscribed by the developers. In general, we have some components. There's the premise, designing the world where the story takes place. Try to give that world some backstory or to feel real. A lot of games just say, there were some gods, those gods fought, and now you're a character in that world. It doesn't do very much with regards to a premise. It doesn't set the stage particularly well. And there we are. Might as well not be there from my perspective. So if you're going to take some time to make a premise, make it believable, make the world feel lived in, so that when the characters have some struggles or they go through something, that it feels like it's engaging in a world that has a history. So it's the entire basis for the narrative. Even if you have a good story, if the premise is bad, it's going to take a while for that story to become meaningful as the player has to engage with and attach themselves to the actual events that are happening rather than having a reasonable premise to start with. A good premise does not have to be long or involved. It can be a short, simple statement that works. Yeah.
Player Obscurity does a really good job of this. They make you totally like feel heartbroken for characters you met like 15 minutes ago.
Yeah.
They do a really good job.
Yeah. And the premise of that is very engaging and can be disseminated in almost a sentence that intrigues you. The same can be said for certain movies. A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. I'm already intrigued. There's a time difference and a spatial difference. Wait, what? So that's an example of a premise, a very short premise, but one that immediately hooks and intrigues you. There's the setting, details of the space in which the story takes place. So the example of the setting, I'll be using Star Wars: A New Hope for all of these, but a moisture farm on the desert planet Tatooine. Again, by itself, not particularly moving, but now we have some details about the story. Characters are characters in the story, people featured in the story. Even if you don't have people in your story, if it is about animals or about, it isn't really about the people, it's about actions, or it's about something, it ends up having something to do with people, with decisions. Every meaningful story ties back to our own existence in some way, shape, or form. It says something about humans and humans' place in the universe. So think about, even if your story has nothing to do with that, tie it back to something that the player can feel. Finally, we have plot, which are the exact sequence of events that take place that define the story. When you have characters, those characters have objectives, and then there are obstacles to those characters attaining those objectives. That's what creates drama. And all of this is based in traditional dramatics, which means that if you study a little bit of traditional dramatics, you get a sense of how you can design a story. So let's take a look at a couple examples of traditional dramatics just to get a sense of what this can look like and how you can design a game story with a very simple layout. Been studied in English classes for thousands of years. One of the most common traditional dramatic structures is Freytag's 5-act structure. Anyone heard of the 5-act structure before in some class?
So,
Couple people? Here's your 5-act structure. Romeo and Juliet follows the 5-act structure. We have our exposition, where you're starting to get a sense of the world that we are in. There aren't particularly high stakes. The focus is on who are the characters. What is the existing tension? But the tension isn't coming to a head at this point yet. We just understand the basis, the history of the tension. There's the rising action where things start happening to the characters, and that fits into the history of the tension. The climax isn't at the end of the story. The climax is in the middle of the story. Something big happens as that tension hits a peak. And then we start dealing with the fallout of that and how that affects the characters and how that affects the future of that tension. So in the 4th act, we end up with falling action as we figure out the results, the effects of what happened in the climax. And then we have a conclusion that happens at the end. This is a great structure for anything that has a lot of drama in it. Yeah.
I like this, but I heard an author before talk about this, basically saying like when you see this sort of chart, it makes it seem like they're all supposed to be the same length or longer. But
Yeah.
realistically, you can have any one of these be like a majority of the story.
Absolutely.
Like this book, the author I was talking about, I can't remember her name, but she wrote the book, The Sword of Kaigen.
Mhm.
which is a great book. And most of the book happens in the falling action,
Yeah,
you know.
yeah, these do not have to be same length by any means. You have a lot of freedom within this, and this is just a structure that is very easy to adhere to. So if you're designing a story, you might ask yourself the question, have I done justice to the exposition? Does the player understand all of the background? Even if it's done very quickly in the opening cutscene, that can be all of the exposition that is needed before the player character takes over and there's immediate rising action to grip the player. You could, on the other hand, have a very long tutorial and have the tutorial be a long sequence of exposition that takes the player character around to lots of locations, meeting lots of characters, and starting to see the existing history of the tension, what might be in the way of those objectives in the future. So there's a lot of wiggle room here, but it gives you a nice way to attack. Have I done each of these elements justice? And this is not the only way to structure your story. This is just one of many possible ways, but we'll go over a couple of them. Questions on the typical 5-act structure? Another one is Sid Field's 3-act structure. We'll do this first, and then we'll do the thing that's there. So again, going back to A New Hope, this is the 3-act structure in and of itself. So we get the hook, something that immediately grabs your attention, that says, wait, something is happening. As A New Hope begins, there is immediate action. There are immediate stakes for characters who we don't even know yet. There's intrigue in why is this happening? What's even going on? But the hook is delivered in such a way that you don't need to know what's going on in order to understand the stakes. And in fact, it's so genius because not a word of dialogue is spoken for the first 10 minutes of the film. It's just stuff happening. But you get a sense of that, which is great. And my favorite parody of the prequel trilogy says, in fact, the opening to Star Wars A New Hope is so genius that I'll bet that George Lucas had nothing to do with it and probably fought against its inclusion in the movie in the first place. I found that to be very fun. After the hook, there's a bit of falling action that leads to the first inciting incident. This is when the plot for the characters really starts to take. This is when the first piece of evidence, the first piece of action is happening for the characters once you understand who they are and what's going on. Then there's some falling action from that, and we find the first plot point, which is kind of a temporary minor climax that marks the end of Act 1. At this point, you have the reason for Act 2. There's now motivation to continue with the story because of what happened. There's fallout from the first plot point, and eventually that leads up to the second plot point at the end of Act 2, where there's a second larger climax from the first plot point. Now you're getting closer to the end, and you can start to see where the climax is going to happen, what's at stake. You start to get a sense of that at the end of Act 2, but note that you didn't really get a sense of that even within Act 1. You didn't understand the tension that was going to be the climax of the movie because it is so far pushed toward the end, rather than being in the middle like it is in Freitag's 5-act structure. Finally, you get to that climax, and all of the stakes come to a head, and you're good to fall out from that. We get a sense of, all right, what happened as a result of that climax? We don't need a ton of time for that, and then the piece of media is over. So what I would like people to do is think about the plot of a movie or a game. Think about a game, find something that is reasonably story-driven. Because this is a game design class, see if you can map the structure of the plot of a game that you have played onto either a 5-act structure or a 3-act structure. And if it doesn't adhere to that, kind of draw out the tension in the plot and see if it adheres to some different kind of structure. What is that structure? Why did it work? Take a bit of time and think about that. And find a way to visualize it too. Draw this on paper or make a sketch of it and a digital sketch.
RPGs like Skyrim,
Mhm.
but like I feel like there's more plot points, right? Because like say you're doing like the main storyline,
Yeah.
like you hit the first one and then you hit the second one, and then like there's a constant like progression, but you're always hitting different plot points until you like meet the final boss or whatever.
Yeah.
And then that's like the climax.
Side quests add a very interesting dilemma to this because it's not necessarily something that is linear. A movie is linear because you have no control over the narrative. Think about the size and scope of side quests. When you're early on in the main story, how much drama are there in the associated side quests? As you reach toward the end of the game, how much drama is there in those side quests? Maybe you could turn this into more of a two-dimensional plot where the main story follows something and the side quests are optional and are adjacent to that main plot point.
But also there's like definitely like side quest encouragement in games like those.
Yeah.
That happen at a certain point. Like you're not getting super encouraged to do side quests at the beginning, really at the very beginning or at the very end. But maybe during the second act, you're getting encouraged to do a ton of side quests.
Yeah. Think about why. What about the design makes that effective or not effective?
I want to maximize the amount of time a player plays their game. Because like a lot of people, when you like buy a game, it's like, especially like a solo game, like a single player game or something, like it's a enjoyment that you get out of it, and the cost like to like I guess benefit analysis on that would be like, did I get 60 hours out of this game or did I just blaze through it 10?
Yeah.
And it's just like if I got 10 hours for like an $80 game nowadays, it's like that's not worth my time.
It depends on the quality of those 10 hours. I would rather have a high quality 10 hour than something that could have been 10 hours dragged out to 80 hours.
I think like side quests in like the context of like RPGs and stuff like that really allow the player to take it at their own pace.
Yeah.
So
Especially if they're optional.
Yeah, they don't want to have to mess with the main story. They don't have to. They can go get a horse. They can go to a house. They can go do their own thing. Or it just breaks up how the gameplay is with the high stakes tensions that might be part of the main plot, and they should go help the cat get a cat out of a tree or something.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially if it's up to the player. They can decide, do I want to go straight into the next big plot point, or do I need some break in between these large plot points where I want to go rescue a cat out of a tree? That could be up to the player. Has anyone mapped out anything and want to share their mapping? Yeah.
Yeah, so this might have spoilers in it, so
Let's try to keep spoilers out of it where possible.
Okay.
Mention the game and then kind of mention the structure maybe without talking about what's happening at any particular point in time.
yeah, so I think the game Red Dead Redemption 2 does the 3-act structure perfectly.
Mm-hmm.
So in the first act, you get this hook, which I'll spoil this because this is right out the gate.
Yeah.
You have to rescue somebody from like wolves,
Yeah.
Instantly you're rescuing somebody from wolves.
Yeah.
And then chills out. Then you go to a new area. And then in this new area, there's like a huge stretch where you're just going and having fun. And then you find out the big twist, which I think is the intro into the third act. And the third act's just like on the rails fast, so fast. You're just like, people are dying, stuff's going down, And then, but then also there's like another act that's like prologue. So I don't know whatever.
Yeah. Interesting. So that's more of kind of it's taking pieces of the 3-act structure and the exposition piece of the prologue of the
Yeah.
of the 5-act
Prologue
structure.
before or after?
Prologue should be probably the first thing that.
Yeah. What's the
that
one that happens after?
Epilogue?
An epilogue. There's an
Yeah.
epilogue.
Okay,
Yeah.
there's an epilogue at the end of the game. Is that kind of the fallout of whatever happened from the climax of the
Yeah.
end of that?
There's like a 10-year gap, and then all of a sudden it's new stuff.
Yeah,
Add context for Red Dead Redemption 1.
yeah. So that seems like kind of the fallout from Act 3, where we go from the climax to there's now an epilogue at the end of that, at the end of Act 3, or maybe even something that could be considered an Act 4 epilogue. Yeah.
A lot of games like don't make it super obvious how to progress. Like they kind of leave it up to the user, like, whether they want to take the side quest or it's not like super obvious what the main quest is. But I feel like one game that makes it very obvious, maybe because it's more for kids, is Breath of the Wild.
Mhm.
Like it's very obvious. These are the 4 bosses we need to beat, and like the final boss. And it's like you can do this like the structure is basically do side quests, beat the one boss, do side quests, beat the other one, and just very obvious like the structure you have to do.
Yeah. Does it end up feeling like heading to a climax that is the boss, fallout, heading to a climax, it's a boss, fallout, heading to a climax, it's a boss, fallout, etc. So it's kind of cyclical in that regard. Is there building tension leading up to each of those boss fights? Or are you doing some things, hey, it's the boss time now? How does that feel?
I feel like in Breath of the Wild, it definitely depends on how you want to play it. Like if you're playing it to beat the bosses, then it definitely can feel like progressive, beat the boss, and progressive. But if you're just kind of playing it to enjoy it, you could save all 4 of the bosses until the last hour of your playing time. Like you don't need to. You can kind of play it, however you feel you want to take that.
Yeah, interesting.
I've been for this I was thinking about Hollow Knight's plot progression.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting because a lot of what happens in the story happens far before you're there. And the story is basically like how the game plays, you basically uncover the story of what had already happened.
Yeah.
And it's only really at the very end of the game where you do anything about it. Since you have to figure out what had happened in this kingdom before you can try to do anything.
Yeah.
So it's almost like the entire game takes place at the climax.
Yeah.
Or actually, not really, because
It's like the whole game is exposition, and then at the very end is
That's actually brings up a perfect point tie into the game that I like to focus on with this, which is Shadow of the Colossus.
Yeah.
Because it's almost very similar in that there's very little going on for the entire game, and you have a moment of epiphany at the very end of the game, and that's the entire game.
But it also does like follow like a minor version of the structure in the sense that each one of the accomplishments is a little bit of the 5x structure repeated over and over again. You know?
What if in terms of dramatics, what if we made this in terms of gameplay instead of story? Is there a gameplay progression that can map onto the dramatic?
Especially like if you're talking about a Metroidvania or a game like Zelda where you're getting new items.
Yeah.
A lot of times like the storyline or like the gameplay is like intrinsically tied to those because it's a moment of struggle, like high tension, and then oh no, you found the new thing. And then it's this sense of exploration that sometimes can calm down or just even be more tense as you're trying to find new stuff.
Yeah.
And explore.
Gear can unlock the ability to hit these different plot points. So you find yourself playing the game in order to gear yourself or prepare yourself for a larger fight and a larger fight and a larger fight. And that way you can play and experience your gear being what allows you to conquer the obstacles that are in your path. And that's not really something that we can easily show with other media.
This will be a job, split the gameplay.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think it just gives thinking in this term, tying your gameplay to the story is important, but also creating a narrative that allows for those obstacles and making that make sense. Your characters are only as strong as the obstacles that are in their way and what they have to overcome in order to reach the natural conclusion of the game. So differences between a linear narrative and an interactive narrative. Your game can do either, but movies or shows have to have a linear narrative. The fact that you're designing a game means that we can now incorporate some aspects of interactive narratives. So there's the concept of plot versus free will. In a linear game or a linear movie or show, there is just the plot. You can incorporate free will into a game. So yeah, linear narrative is a prescribed plot. Everything is going to be in the inscribed layer for that linear plot. Whereas if you have an interactive narrative and have the player having some free will, that allows for some of the decisions that the player has to make are inscribed, but it allows the narrative to dip into that dynamic layer where now the player feels responsible for what's going on. Yeah, free will can either be expensive and difficult to accommodate. It's really difficult to design good choices that the player actually feels like there are multiple reasonable choices. This is an interesting decision. How frequently do you immediately know the dialogue choice that you want to take when you're playing a game versus actually having to think about this or that? A well-designed game should make you really critically analyze a dialogue tree or a decision tree. Do I help this person or that person? Do I go to war or not go to war? That creates kind of a narrative that, yeah.
I just want to add on to that. Have you seen like I think it might be the script for Detroit Becomes Human. Like that is that's like a David Cage game where it's like the entire point is just how much like branching narrative paths you can take.
Yeah.
Like it is like a giant book of like potentially every possible outcome.
There's a ton of design, especially for now that since we're computer scientists, we know the difference between the branching factor of a tree and the depth of a tree. The length of the game is the depth of the tree and the breadth of that tree and all the decisions that have to be made. So as a designer, you have to prescribe every single branch of the tree, and the player in a particular playthrough of the game is only going to play as much as the depth of that tree. So it creates a ton more design for something that the player may never see or experience in the game. So there are downsides to making these kinds of decisions.
Even with the linear narrative, like back to Red Dead Redemption 2, even though you guys are gonna outlaw, there are like morally different outcomes for the thing. So what he's gonna do the same thing regardless. He's gonna at the end of the story, he's gonna be in the same place. But even every quest, it's like, oh, should I get more money or save the people?
Yeah.
So even though the story's on rails, you feel different about it depending on how you do it.
Yeah, if it's done very well, then the player feels responsible for their choices. I feel like their choices led to what was inscribed in the first place by the developers as the action point, but it feels more fluid and the player feels like they had more control over it. That is difficult to achieve because every path has to feel that way.
Oh, sorry, I just want to add on to that. It's still the David Cage thing. I will say though that like when it comes to like the David Cage game, there is certainly this feeling of like how much options there are is very tricky because next thing you know, you either need one or next thing you know, the plot kind of feels contrived because there isn't another option to accommodate this thing or not. Like, it's like in the game there's sort of like a evil or like good guy or bad guy role where you either be android or a human. And it's like, in this scenario, why if you're going evil, why are you trying to console the robot? Just do the robot thing if you're going the evil routes. It's like, it's like contrived instances like this.
I think what you're getting at is really well represented in the rise of the choices matter tag on Steam, because like in an effort to prune those decision trees, sometimes a lot of them will be a graph. And they'll convert back down onto like the same graph.
It expands but then contracts back to another prescribed path.
Yeah.
So it doesn't have to be an exponentially increasing tree. It can be something that temporarily increases and then finds a way to condense itself back into.
But it does, you have to make a decision that doesn't feel like it matters because you realize that it just condensed back down.
Right. It's hard to not break the fourth wall with that, where you feel like no matter what decisions I made, I was always going to be here anyway. So it feels like my decision didn't matter.
That can also be like part of the story in the sense like with the game Until Dawn, which I love the fact that it shows you the tree at the end.
Yeah.
You get to see it, that's just cool. But also this like pitifulness that you feel where you're like, no, it's like, it's always going to be this way. You're always going to wind up with this happening at the end. And it fully demonstrates that. And that's part of the story.
Yeah.
It's like part of the lore.
Yeah.
And if it wasn't part of the lore, it would be extremely lame. But
yeah. Really cool. So there are ways that we can allow for free will in games. The first is just having a limited number of possibilities. Player is presented with a few possibilities, and they choose one of those possibilities. And then it's up to you, the designer, to deal with the fallout of that particular choice. Optional linear side quests, kind of a binary choice on the player's side. Do I engage with this optional side quest or do I not? Then the player can either choose to explore some more lore, some more character backstory, maybe get some kind of gameplay benefit as part of it, Or if you're really focused just on the main plot, you can ignore it and just power forward in the main plot. You can foreshadow multiple possibilities. If it's linear in nature, you know what's going to happen. You've designed what's going to happen. You can start to foreshadow what's going to happen. And then the player notices from that foreshadowing and can make decisions that lead closer to that foreshadowing, or fight against that foreshadowing because they don't want that particular outcome to happen. And that becomes a very interesting way to branch a narrative in two. You start to foreshadow something's going to happen, and then the player is responsible for whether it happens or it doesn't, based on the choices that they make that fight for or against that foreshadowing happening. And then the player feels like they were either responsible for that event happening or not. They prevented it from happening with decisions that they made. You can also do fun things like develop minor NPCs into major ones optionally, depending on the actions that the player takes. Different minor characters can become major characters and start to have a hand in the plot based on that. They can either become members of your party and start to have dialogue and relations within your party, or you leave them behind and they just continue to go live about their minor NPC lives. Or it can be something like Shadow of Mordor, Shadow of War, where your who killed you last time gets promoted and now becomes someone you get revenge on because they killed you in the past when they were weaker. Now they're stronger and become more of a boss fight. It creates a feeling of overcoming that from the player's perspective. More on linear and interactive narratives, there's the concept of the empathetic character versus the avatar. So in linear narratives, the player is expected to empathize with the main character, and that can be very challenging as a developer to make sure that everyone who's playing this game actually empathizes with what the character is going through. That leads to some constraints on the design of that main character. You can't make anything reasonably controversial within that because some of your players will feel like that's motivation, and other players it will feel like that's breaking the fourth wall. I don't care about that, so why are we making such a big deal of it? On the other hand, in interactive narrative, the player is the main character, so you can either give them choice, or you can make them feel like their decisions that they make in the game are why the game is happening the way that it is. So games like Tomb Raider and Halo, main character has their own personality. You are taking on that role of that personality. On the other hand, in games that have character creators, most frequently Skyrim, World of Warcraft, the kind of character that you want to be, and the game respects the decision of who they want to be within that role. So instead, the character is an avatar of the player. You can either project your personality onto that avatar, or you can play the role of a personality that's vastly different from yours and try to role play that scenario. Both of those are perfectly viable. Reasons why you should design your own dramatics so that the players can feel something. A lot of players want to feel something when they play a game, that their decisions have value and meaning. A lot of that comes from the decisions that the designers make. You can learn a lot through reading about how to evoke emotion through narrative. If you're interested in going and designing games for a living, I would highly recommend that you take some classes from the English department on concepts like this. How can you evoke emotion in your design? Yeah.
Yeah, since game design is my end goal of my degree, I actually, talking to my advisor, got put on track for design as my major, and they recommend I either minor or just take some courses in film since it help with narratives and stuff.
Absolutely. And in a larger company, if you want to work for a larger company, you're going to have story designers. There are going to be lots of different roles. You don't have to be everything within the concept of the game design. But I find that if you are aware of it, even if you're just a technical designer, you can take note of what is the intended emotion that it gets evoked. And now you can incorporate that technically into your role as well. In larger games, sometimes it feels like aspects of those games are fighting with each other, where technically it's obvious the people weren't on the same page as the writers in terms of the game almost fights with itself. If you're aware of it, then you can try to create a larger picture, a greater whole, a game that's more than the sum of its parts.
It's also like perfectly if you want to get into game design, good practice is just to make stories, like totally ignore the game part of it and just write a story.
Write a story, and then that can become something that you design a game around. Yeah, be a dungeon master in D&D.
Yeah.
So motivation and justification as well. The player wants to feel like they're doing what they're doing for a reason, that their actions are justified within the scope of the game world. Progression and reward. It feels good to have gotten through a plot point, like, the actual narrative itself is a measure of progress in the game, especially for really any story-driven game. Within that, if the story is linear and has a completion percentage, it can make you feel like you are accomplishing something by just engaging with the story. At the end of a level, the cutscene, the fallout of the gameplay that happened is part of a reward. Watching a meaningful cutscene take that tension and resolve it can reinforce the mechanics of the game. Although games can also do the opposite of this, where you have a level 1 character who takes 10 hits to kill everything, and then in the cutscene at the end, one-shots 1,000 enemies. Like, what was that power while I was playing the game? It can do exactly the opposite as well. That really breaks the fourth wall narratively for me. It should feel like the gameplay and the cutscenes go hand in hand with the power of the character with the story that's going on.
One of my pet peeves is you're playing the shooter game and like you're taking bullets all the time, and then in a cutscene somebody threatens you with a gun.
Yeah.
Oh no, don't shoot me.
Yeah.
It's like, well, that's true.
Yeah. When the story is forced on you like that, it really makes you aware that you're playing a game.
Oh yeah, it's like. So I'm just thinking of other David Cage game, really about just how.
Yeah. Technology. This is what you use to enable the game to be played. Includes things like any randomizers, state tracking. So what are the player character's stats? Scores, tables, character sheets. What is the character currently capable of? You can use this with AI to give them a challenge based on their current ability level. Any progression. So technological designs of things, how much experience is required to level up, what skills are available at which levels, etc. Tech tree and civilization. Character leveling, really any of that. We'll spend a good chunk of this class focused on inscribed technology because I find that as game designers, this is something that we can understand that mathematical progression, and it really makes or breaks the feeling of immersion in a game, almost more so than anything else. So we'll spend some time on this. So now we can summarize the next layer, the dynamic layer. The inscribed layer has the most to it, just because it's what we have the most control over. But once we finish inscribing everything and then ship the game to some players, how they engage with it is the dynamic layer. All play, all strategy, all choice emerges within the dynamic layer. One way to think of a game is it's not a game until someone's actually playing it. There's the idea of a game, but it's not the concept of it. It's not really a game until someone is actively engaging with it. Other media exists without an audience, but games don't really exist without an audience, unless it is completely linearly distributed. A game is altered by the participation of the player. How the player plays the game changes the game. So we'll come back tomorrow and get through the dynamic layer. There is more fun on the other side of this, I swear.